Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's podcast is the third interview with Kaya Bentley about psychopharmacotherapy. Kaya Bentley is professor of social work at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and has published extensively in the area of psychopharmacotherapy. Psychopharmacotherapy is a long word that refers to the treatment of psychiatric disorders with the use of medication. But as Kaya points out, psychopharmacotherapy is not just about giving people medication and calling it a day. It's an approach to treatment that acknowledges the strengths and limitations of medications. In today's podcast, Kaya talked about a recent and, as of July 2008, unpublished study she did on the meaning that residents of an inpatient psychiatric facility made out of medication. Kaya's study was qualitative, meaning that she analyzed the text of interviews and drawings from the residents to get her results. One of the purposes of qualitative research is to develop a deeper understanding of the meanings that people make out of their lives and experiences. Our conversation turned out to not only be a fascinating view into the meanings that residents made of medication, but it was also a wonderful sketch of Kaya's process of making meaning out of the interviews and drawings. In qualitative research, the researcher is the analytical tool, and Kaya's struggles with making sense of these meanings is central to qualitative inquiry. As I mentioned, this is the third of 3 interviews with Kaya on psychopharmacotherapy. The first 2 can be found at the Social Work Podcast website at socialworkpodcast.com. In the first interview, Kaya and I talked about key concepts and the role that social workers can play in psychopharmacotherapy. In the second interview, Kaya talked about best practices for referring clients for psychiatric medications and resources for social workers interested in learning more about psychopharmacotherapy and how social workers can think critically about psychopharmacotherapy for both adults and children. Now, all 3 interviews were recorded using Skype. This is because Kaya was in Richmond, Virginia, and I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And during the interviews, I noticed some pops and hisses, presumably the result of network congestion or bandwidth bottlenecks. Not that I'm really sure what those mean, but they were not enough to detract from the interviews. If you have questions or comments for me or Kaya about these interviews, please go to the Social Work Podcast website at socialworkpodcast.com. And now on to the interview with Kaya Bentley and making meaning out of medication. Kaya, earlier in our conversation, you talked about a recent study, an unpublished study of qualitative interviews with residents of a treatment facility who talked about the meaning of medication. And you said that there were 7 dimensions of meaning. And I was fascinated by that comment and particularly the book group that came out of it. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit more about that. And I realize that it hasn't been published, and I think it's a great opportunity to get the information out there before it gets published. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So what I want to tell you about is I did some research out at this residential facility and had 21 participants, and they were in 3 different levels of care, including a sort of a higher intense, almost treatment setting, and then apartments, and then they had folks that live out in the community that came in for services. But I did interviews with them about their life experience with medications, and particularly its impact on their sense of self. And I also had them do drawings, Jonathan. I had them draw pictures, colored pictures of what medication conveyed to them, and got back some fascinating results that I want to tell you about. Basically, I took their narratives and analyzed and had them transcribed and analyzed them qualitatively, and came up with 7 different dimensions of meaning. And as I mentioned, sort of the center of the 7, if you can picture 7 interlocking circles, at that center is the part that I said medication incites meaning, influences identity, and impacts life. So one of the dimensions was that medication is a positive force across lots of different areas of functioning. So the folks discussed the positive impact on their brain. They'd say things like, it fixes my brain, it helps my chemical imbalance, blah, 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 reduces symptoms, improves cognitions, and they would go on and on about the range of positive effects. On the other hand, they also talked about, second, medication as a tolerated fact of life, just that notion of this undeniable, sort of unavoidable toleration, particularly of side effects like headaches and appetite and decreased sex drive and twitching and restlessness and all that. So there's this sort of other toleration meaning making that happened. Third, which I really had a hard time putting into words, and the way I have it now is psychiatric medication as primarily an internal and individual experience, meaning that the act of taking medication is really very individualized physiological and psychological experience. I actually expected it to, because I kind of came from a symbolic interactionist perspective, to that other sort of societal and family forces would loom larger in terms of meaning, and they're certainly not irrelevant, but really what goes on physiologically and psychologically, positive effects and negative effects, really impacts meaning a great deal. The other thing that became true, the fourth aspect of meaning, was that the story of one's mental illness and struggle with mental disorders cannot be separated from the story of one's medication. So as people told me the story of their lives and how they, medication changes and side effects and hospitalizations and run-ins with the law and this marriage or that marriage, it was all entwined. It's not like you can talk about medication and mental illness as separate. And these people had long, long histories of mental illness. I think the hospitalizations, I had somebody who had been hospitalized 50 times. It was, very common to have 20 hospitalizations. Many of them were on, up to 6 medications, and very, very long. Most of them with diagnoses of schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder. So it really, people had struggled quite long with severe mental illnesses. The fifth sort of meaning was psychiatric medication as a basis of gratitude and a source of victory over past struggles. And so the current positive experience many people had with medication represented sort of this triumph that I mentioned, and they could vividly recall and recount the dramatic movement of their lives. And that was, a little bit of a surprise to see how pervasive that theme was. At the same time, the sixth aspect of meaning was psychiatric medication as a necessary for the prevention of relapse and what I call the protection of humanness. And so it was very clear that many of these folks absolutely dreaded and feared another relapse, because relapses were so interruptive and so negative in their life experience that they really were taking medication to remain stable and to not relapse, so that they would feel like a full human being, basically. So that's what I say. And then the final one was, in the face of that, psychiatric medication as a symbol of differentness and dependency. So that even, and for some people, dependency on medication was a benign term. It was like, yeah, I'm dependent on it, so what? A lot of people are dependent on insulin or heart medication or whatever. And for other people, differentness and dependency were associated, frankly, with melancholy. And so that was sort of the conundrum of medication as an avenue to sort of full humanness and a more positive life experience, but also this edge of felt differentness and resignation.
It really sounds like for these adults, these 21 adults, the meanings were fairly complex. It wasn't just that, medication means that I'm sick and end of story.
Yes, you're right.
It's really hard or it's impossible to separate medication from the experience of mental illness, or perhaps even taking it one step further out, the experience of being.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes. So I would say, Jonathan, you just one of my I had two piles of results. One pile is the typology of meaning that I just described. And by the way, each of the 21 pictures, because I let the residents title and interpret their own drawing. I didn't interpret it. So each of the drawings is placed under one of the meanings of medication, and at some point I'll have a website to go to view that. I'm trying to get this published now, so I don't, and obviously no one is going to publish 21 colored pictures from me, so I'm probably going to have to create a website where I can put those. But I was struck in terms of my other kind of results of how expert these people suffering from severe mental illness were, that they were able to discriminate between psychiatric medications and other medications. They offered very vivid, insightful accounts, that very precise histories of diagnosis and treatment. They seemed very aware what the doctors were doing. And of course, now this is just one setting. It's a nonprofit setting, a coveted facility or agency in Richmond and
Richmond, Virginia,
and the area. Yes. So we don't know how generalizable these are. That wasn't the purpose of the study, to find generalizable results, but this was just these folks' experience, and they had a high level of expertise and were very impressive. And so obviously the words that are associated with the meanings are my words from my analysis of the data, but certainly as I did my member checks and went back to them with the PowerPoint, by the way, a PowerPoint of all the drawings and a PowerPoint of essentially the typology, which, as I said, is this 7 interlocking circles. It totally resonated with them. I had people coming up to me and they were, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so important. And, one man came up with tears in his eyes and, God, what are you doing? How can we get word out about this study? And, I was like, well, I am trying to get it published. He goes, we have to let NAMI know, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. Just the results totally resonated with the participants. And I've been lucky enough, as I said, to share them not only with the participants, but with the entire agency, the entire agency's board. I've done a couple of presentations here in Virginia, hope to do some national presentations, and I'm not the first person to do this. I mean, Jerry Flourish in our own field has done studies, grant-funded studies of meaning and medication among youth.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about the 7 dimensions was that there are a number of discussion points that can be very valuable for a social worker, both to better understand what their client's experience, but also for the client to have feedback that their social worker understands them. And this,
absolutely,
this is the development of the therapeutic alliance. And by the social worker understanding how their clients have made meaning out of this experience of medication, the social worker can then help the client to negotiate some of the decisions that they might make about medication or their treatment in a way that would be less informed without engaging in these conversations.
Totally. You just hit the nail on the head. Absolutely.
And it sounds like that really fits in with that idea of partnership that we were talking about before.
Yes.
Okay.
So you remember, not only, the study that I did, or we did back, that was published in Social Work on what real social workers are really doing out there, there were a lot of discussion-focused activities that social workers do very, very frequently or often, discussing feelings, as I mentioned, discussing combined effects of medication and psychosocial interventions, discussing problems, discussing adherence, discussing pros and cons, blah, blah, blah. But I guess my argument, too, is, we can do more than just discuss. And so that's why it was exciting for me after this study to work out with the agency these number of things to do at this agency to better reflect the lives and experiences of residents with respect to medication, and to give the residents and clients essentially an opportunity to extend the conversation, if you will, about the impact of medication on their lives. So the book club that I mentioned was one thing. Another idea that came up was to sort of self-publish a collection of life stories of people at the agency. I have already been back and given 2 sessions with the staff, and want to do it with the clients, on how do you get clients to talk with their physicians and prescribers about medication. How can we do better coaching and teaching folks how to do that? I created sort of a list of open-ended questions for counselors to use. Somebody else at the agency is looking at their intake form to see if there are ways to improve their intake form that will allow people more of a chance to talk about medications. I mentioned they actually have a pile of different groups there, a grief group, a medication education group, a current events group, a cinema group, and we've talked about how in each of those groups over the course of the next year or so could incorporate things like, not just talking about the loss of a loved one or the loss of a pet, but how about the loss around having a mental illness? Or not just current events, what's happening in the political arena, but what about current events, what about new developments in psychiatric medication and new research on managing side effects? And not just a movie about mental illness, but a movie that really talks about people's response to the meaning of mental illness, and other things, following up in art therapy, and then interestingly, because part of the results essentially talk about humanness and wanting and the desire to be human. Some of the things that people came up with had nothing at all to do with medication, but to implement policy changes that made this agency affirm residents' humanity and dignity and choice more fully. My favorite one, I really don't know if it's directly related to this research, but probably not, but maybe had something to do with it in terms of this issue of humanity, is they removed in the apartments that residents have, they removed the locks on the thermostats. Now, can you imagine anything more affirming of humanity and choice? First of all, can you imagine, Jonathan, that if you in your own home, if you had to go ask somebody for a key to the cover of the thermostat in order to adjust it?
Yeah, I would feel like I was at my office at work.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So they had all sorts of things. They used to not allow residents to be in the same car together. So these sort of lack of trust and lack of human choice for adults were some of the policies that they're looking at. And that's part of the recovery movement in general, part of the move in mental health to put consumer desires and consumers' life at the center of practice, as is discussed in the literature on the strengths perspective. But it sure has been slow going, and I'm glad to see that this place is doing some of those things.
It sounds like a great environment.
Yeah.
It sounds like the kind of place that we would hope that all treatment facilities would be like, to do things as simple as removing the locks from climate control.
Exactly.
Well, Kaya, this has been fascinating, and I really appreciate you talking about this brand new research that you're doing that is not yet published, and because of the process of publication, people might have had to have wait a year or two to get this information. And so I appreciate you sharing it
Sure.
on the podcast. I think it's a great way of getting that out there as quickly as possible, and certainly incredibly relevant to social workers.
Thank you.
And hopefully other folks, not non-social workers, but other providers who listen to the podcast. So thank you so much for taking the time to,
You're welcome.
To share with us. It's been an absolute delight. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.